Hello everybody. Sorry this week didn't quite go according to plan, but my hope is to upload this video to try to make it as concise as possible, mostly to be honest, because I just recorded 20 minutes and then it glitched and didn't work, so I'm having to do it again. But hopefully to keep it pretty concise. And to point out first that the PowerPoint is in two parts. One is for this week, and then you'll see the divided place where part two begins. We'll take care of that part two not next week, but the week after. This coming week is when we were to have visited the School for the Deaf and Blind, and I'll have an alternate assignment for instead of a field experience assignment that I'll post next week. So to dive right in, the PowerPoint for this week begins with, and we're talking about inborn variations of development. So that inborn relates to being born with, basically. We're going to discuss a little bit of genetics, because that's what these disabilities are sort of based on or have their origins in, and then go through a handful of them and discuss their characteristics, etiology, and some treatment. So for genetics, when you say the word genetics, or when you see the word genetics, what we mean is the study of heredity and variations in the characteristics of organisms, whether they be plant or animal. And genetic research can be understood as being fairly important because when studying disabilities or conditions that are genetic in cause, we can actually learn a lot about how they develop, how they unfold or play out, and also learn a lot about what we can do to treat them and even prevent them at times. So that's part of the utility of having research in our back pocket is we can, as early childhood professionals, we can organize our interventions with that knowledge in mind and allow it to guide our treatment plans and our intervention plans with the children and families we work with. So I've linked a few videos that I want you to watch to this first PowerPoint. The first distinguishing three main concepts of genetics, which are DNA, genes, and chromosomes. DNA could be thought of as kind of like the basic structure, the most basic or at the smallest level of genetic development. And building upon that simple kind of germinal idea of DNA being the sequences of or patterns of DNA that kind of combine to make what are called genes. Genes are like bundles of those sequences and genes are like pieces of information. So they're like codes, like strings of code. And one variation or one subcategory in that idea, that concept of genes, is called alleles. And I've linked a video to that because I think it's a helpful one. And in that video, it's described as genes themselves being something like the brand of Coca-Cola, and alleles being something like variations of that brand, Coca-Cola, like Diet Coke, Coke Zero, Cherry Coke, stuff like that. So in the context of genetics, genes themselves would be like the brand, quote unquote, of, say, eye color, and alleles would be the variations of that one characteristic, that one brand. So blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, whatever else. And the words genotype, phenotype, and karyotype I've listed there basically because they just sound pretty similar and it's useful to know the difference. Actually, I ordered them wrong. I think phenotype would be easiest to understand first. Phenotype is the appearance based on genetic expression. It's the visual or perceptible expression of genes. So, hanging with eye color, I think at least I have green eyes, and so when you look at my eyes and they're green, you can see they're green. That's a phenotype. That's an example of a phenotype. you can perceive the expression of genes. Genotype, on the other hand, is not something that we visibly see or otherwise see. That's the pattern of genetics within us that make up the phenotype. Okay, so based on my genotype, the structures or patterns of genes that make me up, the phenotype, green eyes, appears. Okay, and karyotype is can mean a couple of different things, but the way that we're talking about it here can mean the visual representation of the pattern of chromosomes for a human being or any other type of organism. So it's quite literally can be thought of as a picture of your chromosomes. Okay, so what are chromosomes? Chromosomes, if DNA is like this basic layer, and building on that more complex is genes, and building on that more complex is chromosomes. And chromosomes are bundles or combinations of genes, which are themselves like code-like combinations of DNA. Okay, and so we all have, human beings have 46 pairs of chromosomes. 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 total chromosomes, and the 23rd pair makes up what are called the sex chromosomes, or the gametes, the male and female sex chromosomes, which are either XX or XY. Okay, so I've linked to another video to cell division, the term cell division, because the video linked there does a good job at accurately describing the processes of mitosis and meiosis. But put really briefly, mitosis is basically a cloning. Okay, so it's a reproduction of that results in what are called a daughter cell that contains the full 46 chromosomes of the parent cell. Okay, so one cell is reproduced or cloned or identically produced again, and that resulting cell has a full 46 set of chromosomes. Meiosis, on the other hand, basically splits one cell in half and creates two separate gametes or sex cells of sperm or ovum that only contain half of the 46 chromosomes, so only contain 23, not 23 pair, but 23 chromosomes. The purpose of that, of course, as is the purpose of the sperm or the ovum, is to be linked or combined with another gamete to create a full set of 46 chromosomes, which can then be reproduced through the process of mitosis, the identical reproduction. So throughout this chapter, in more variations of development, we're talking about gene or genetic disabilities. And there are a few ways we can think about what that means or how that comes about. Single gene disorder means that one particular gene is impacted, and we'll get into what we'll have to get into whether it's a recessive or a dominant gene, meaning that if it's a recessive, both parents have to have it. If it's a dominant, only one parent has to have it in order for it to be passed on to the offspring. Sex-linked disorders relate specifically to that 23rd pair of chromosome, this XX or XY. Chromosome disorders are disorders that originate from some disturbance or malformation of one specific identifiable chromosome. Okay, so that's really narrow, just like gene disorders are really narrow. Multifactorial disorders, on the other hand, are pretty broad. Multifactorial means that a lot of factors play a part in the disorder's development, and the multifactorial can be congenital, which just basically means you're born with it, or predispositional, which means you don't really have the disorder, you're predisposed to developing it later in life. So since disorders in this case are genetic, they're based on genes, Some parents elect to have genetic testing done, prenatal testing done. And a few ways that that could be done is through blood sampling. So some genetic disorders can be predicted through blood testing. The process of an amniocentesis is the taking of a long needle and injecting it into a pregnant woman's stomach to extract some of the amniotic fluid to be tested that way. And ultrasound, which we covered last week, using high frequency sound to create a real-time image of the baby in utero, that can also sometimes be used to predict genetic disorders. So let's get into a few of them briefly. So cystic fibrosis is the most common fatal genetic disease in the U.S. Characteristics of what make up cystic fibrosis is the thick mucus that develops in the lungs that basically blocks the airways and interferes with the breathing process. It's a very, very challenging thing to work with, and eventually does result in death of the infant. Part of what the diagnostic process is pretty simple, though. They use a sweat test, so higher levels of salt in the sweat actually indicates a higher risk for cystic fibrosis, or may point to cystic fibrosis as being present. Etiology, or the origin of this, is that it's an autosomal recessive gene disorder. So autosomal refers to any of the first 22 pair of chromosomes, not the sex chromosomes. So autosomal means anything but that sex chromosome, okay, of the 23rd pair. And recessive, as I mentioned, means that both parents have to be carriers of it in order for it to be passed on. Treatment should be multidisciplinary. That means that a lot of different professionals should be on the same team to work with not only the child but the parents and family themselves. And it's worth noting that cost of treatment can be really high. They require a lot of medications, frequent hospitalizations, and things like that. Down syndrome is also called trisomy 21, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's an intellectual disability that has a range from mild to severe, and many of you have probably worked with or known about or known individuals with Down syndrome, so you might recognize its physical characteristics. But I've listed some of them anyway because some you might not have noticed or might not have known about. Its etiology is really directly known. It results in its name, trisomy 21. Tri means three, of course, like a tricycle. Somy relates to the Greek word soma, which means body, so three body. And 21 refers to the 21st chromosome. So there's an extra body, an extra chromosome. There's an extra of the 21st chromosome. Okay, that's what makes this disability occur. Higher maternal age does seem to be linked to an increased risk, and that's important to know. For treatment, physical therapy and occupational therapy are kind of the go-tos. Children are guided to learn more about themselves and how to relate to others, how to regulate their own emotions, how to build self-help skills, and how to manage kind of like daily life. Okay, next, Fragile X syndrome is the leading cause of intellectual disability. It was formerly misdiagnosed as a few things like autism and ADHD, pervasive developmental disorder, or PDD. But we've come to find that it actually is its own individual disorder. And I've listed a couple of the kind of linked characteristics to it. It does affect boys more severely than girls. And the etiology, or the cause, is that there's a mutation, as the kind of name suggests, a mutation on the X chromosome. It happens to be that fathers pass to daughters, but not to sons. And the treatment for this, the medications, can be helped from mood stabilization. With intellectual disabilities, and particularly this one, sometimes emotional dysregulation can be a present quite substantially. And also, sleep can be impacted pretty significantly, and ADHD symptoms can be a part of that too. Next, muscular dystrophy. So we've talked about cerebral palsy as being brain injury related to a difficulty in motor functioning, right? That's a non-degenerative disease where the brain and the muscles, to put it simply, are basically not connected efficiently enough for the muscles to work well. And that can lead to muscle deterioration due to not using the muscles, but it's a non-degenerative disease or disability. Muscular dystrophy, on the other hand, is directly a muscular disease. It's a muscle wasting disease, is the way to think about it. So it is degenerative. And the characteristics, as you might imagine, are weakness during gross motor activity, like running and jumping and stuff. Um, uh, Tends to deteriorate between ages 8 and 12. Death usually occurs around the age of 25, so it is a definite degenerative disease. It leads to death. We don't know how to cure it or stop it. Etiology, the cause of it is an X-linked recessive inheritance patterns that we've noticed. So it's a sex-related or sex-linked disorder, and it is a recessive disability, so both parents have to be carriers. For treatment, as I kind of mentioned, there's no way to stop it. There's no cure. Um, there are limited interventions. So family intervention and emotional support tends to be what's focused on, as the child, as they grow, won't be growing in the same way as a typical child, and will be very dependent eventually because their muscles will deteriorate and will not allow them to take care of themselves, and that will come at great psychological or emotional cost if interventions aren't put into place to sort of support that transition. And even then, of course, it's a gruesome thing to go through for the child and the parents. Okay, so I told you I'd try to be concise. So those are some of the few disabilities that we're covering for this week. Look for some assignments in the upcoming days in the next week or so related to this, and the following half of the chapter, remember, will be the week after next. Next week I'll have some things up on Blackboard as a replacement assignment for the field experience that we didn't get to go to this time. So as always, reach out to me, especially during this time of distance learning, as if problems arise, and I'll do my best to make sure to give you ample information through Blackboard about assignments as are due, and the materials that we're going through week to week.